Just a couple of weeks ago, Francis went on 60 Minutes, and you'd think that the question of deaconettes would be done. He said no to ordained deaconesses. The key word here is ordained. He has said no to it. Orthodox-minded Catholics celebrated online, not generally realizing that the key word there was ordained, that the issue is likely to get pushed and pushed and pushed. And progress for the other side will likely be made in the form of non-ordained deaconesses. That's probably what's going to happen at some point in the future. But the question here really is, will they give up on this issue? And the answer is, of course, no, they won't. So Cardinal Mueller gave an interview to a Swiss Catholic newspaper. This newspaper is extremely heterodox. Think National Catholic Reporter, American Magazine, Katholisch.de, these kinds of outlets. He gave this to a Swiss outlet, this interview. And he was given all the usual kinds of questions. And I don't like reading interviews, the question and answer format, but it will really be useful here to do that, to give you an idea of what he was going up against. Before you do that, I'm going to give you another idea of what he was going up against, because they published an article that really shows you where they are as an outlet on this. So the headline you get from cath.ch is Vatican expert Marco Politi. Pope takes a zigzag approach to female diaconate. Vatican expert Marco Politi criticizes the reform-oriented forces in the world church. They're behaving too passively in the current synodal process. Bishops' conferences should mobilize. Last autumn, they sat obediently at their tables, he told the South Tyrolean Sonntagsblatt. That's the headline. This is a companion article to the interview. And the rub of that article is that the bishops need to take the initiative on this. And he's not wrong in that if they want to go their way, that's what they have to do. And I say that because Francis has shown the great unwillingness to enforce the laws of the church against those he agrees with, except for extremely egregious things. And you would think this would be among them, but because Francis's worldview is focused on the material and on the secular, it has to be along those lines. Bring you the Bishop of Bling, if you remember him, back in like 2013 or 2014. Very early on, he got a lot of applause for them. And that bishop is still in service to the church. He's actually a Bergoglian by all reports. He was just told no on building a gigantic, opulent refectory for himself. And again, there's nothing wrong with Francis telling him no on that. But you compare the times he has come down against those in his own camp, against conservative and traditionalist bishops, and you see the complete difference in how they are handled. So the bishops here, and I'm sure someone will try this, will probably at some point begin trying to ordain deaconettes. They'll do it on their own initiative. They'll probably wait for Francis as a document on this, which will come at some point, probably later this year, before the Synod on Sin is done. That will likely happen. It'll be his document will say non-ordained, but the chances are very good that the bishops will push the envelope on this for themselves. And the rub of that article is that the bishops should ignore Francis's statement about the impossibility of the sacrament of holy orders being given to women. It's worth reminding ourselves that there's been an effort after that to represent the diaconate as something that doesn't require the sacrament of holy orders, so they can have non-ordained deaconesses. In case you haven't seen my reports on this, right after the 60 Minutes article, America Magazine and a few other outlets published articles talking about how ordination should not be required for the diaconate anymore, that there's no reason to ordain deacons. They never once mentioned deaconesses in those articles, but the point was pretty clear in context. If you take out the sacrament of holy orders from the equation, then there's nothing stopping them from putting women, quote, back into an ancient role. That is very dubious anyway, on especially their presentation of it. There's nothing to stop them from getting what they want. Because if you remember, putting the non-ordained in there kicks the door open for a bishop like what you're about to hear to step forward and just ordain them themselves. Because once they do that, there's no going back. Knowing full well that Francis won't do anything about it. This article is very short, so you'll see what I mean. It's from the article, quote, "The Synod is helping to put pressure on reform, but it depends very much on the direction in which the majority of dioceses and continental bishops' conferences go. The Pope cannot push through everything without consensus," said the publicist and Vatican expert. "When it comes to the issue of women's diaconate, it is clear, quote, that the Pope is taking a zigzag path as a politician," explained Politi. "Francis has decided to separate the, quote, women's question from the World Synod and to form a group of experts to deal with the issue until June 2025. The Pope wants to do something in this area, but we don't know what this diaconate will look like," said the Observer. Let's pause there. What this diaconate will look like. In the mind of this Vatican insider, it's a foregone conclusion you're going to get some kind of deaconesses. It's a foregone conclusion. They just don't know what the nuts and bolts will look like, except that Francis has publicly said numerous times no to being ordained. Now, it could very well be that the purpose of that working group is to actually say, no, the ancient church actually did ordain. Here's all of our, cherry-picked evidence for this. And so, because they did that, the times that the popes have spoken against this in the intervening 2 years have clearly not been indelible declarations, because in fact, so you clearly can now ordain, and that might be what happens. Let's go back to the article. Last year, Francis also began inviting female theologians to the Council of Cardinals to discuss the role of women. Most recently, the Pope publicly spoke out against the sacramental diaconate. Francis has opened up new areas in his pontificate so far, says Politi. Now it depends on the bishops' conferences and the grassroots, whether they mobilize or not. In Rome, there is an attitude in certain church circles along the lines of, let's let Francis do what he wants, then we'll concentrate on his successor, said the Vatican expert. Conservative circles in the church are acting very aggressively. Politi told the Sonntagsblatt that he had noticed passivity among the bishops delegated to the World Synod. Last autumn, they sat obediently at their tables, but there is no pressure from below, as was the case at the Second Vatican Council. And there he's referring at Vatican II to what's called the Media Council. This pressure from below was exercised on bishops who didn't really want to go along with opening up ecumenical dialogue and changing the Mass and all the other things they did. It came from at least two forms. And one of the from below was the Pariti. These are the experts at the council who were either priests or laymen. And the other came from the actual press. In those days, the press put pressure on the Vatican. There's a third source that I'm researching, probably for a book, because what I've found so far is not terribly surprising for those paying attention to, we'll say, current events in America. But that's what he's referring to here. Back to the article. He says, the latter became a reform council because reform-oriented bishops mobilized, rejected the agenda, and demanded a say in topics and commissions, said the journalist. What is important now is that the bishops and lay people do in the autumn, and whether there will be a dialectic between the assembly and the leadership, that is the big question mark. End quote. All that is to set up for Cardinal Mueller. That outlet is pushing positively the idea of laity and brave bishops working together to put pressure on Rome and to get some brave bishop to act independent of the Vatican to start ordaining those who can't be ordained. They don't really care what the church has said on this throughout history. The goal is what they want. The ends justify the means. Bear all that in mind. As we go to the same outlet for about the same time with an interview from Cardinal Mueller. Now, something I want to stress here is that these articles were published in Swiss, and so we're using a translation extension, which is why things might be a little clunky. I'll have links to them in my show notes at returntoversion.org a few minutes after this stream is over, so you can read them for yourself, but you'll need some kind of translation extension to do this. So the headline from cath.ch, the Swiss outlet, Cardinal Mueller, it is sacramentally impossible to ordain women as priests. Only men can represent Christ, says Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Mueller. Women cannot be called to this office. That must be a mistake. He sees the Ted McCarrick problem as an ideology that seeks to prejudge innocent priests, and he describes Bishop Felix Mueller as a smart guy. We're going to go over this with commentary throughout. Like I said, for those joining us late, Interviews don't really work as a just read it verbatim kind of thing, but here we kind of have to. So you can see the kinds of questions, the straw man that they are setting up to try to take down the actual Catholic position on this question, and Cardinal Mueller's having none of it. And good for him on that. So he is asked, Pope Francis is giving women more opportunities in the church. How do you see this? Trying to bait him into giving an answer that discredits the actual church position on the question at hand. His response is, that's a strange narrative that needs to be put into perspective. It's not the greater goodness of Pope Francis that is now giving women more opportunities, but that is something completely different from the question of whether women can become priests. That is not related to emancipatory and sociological aspects. And then they ask him, well, basically, what do you mean? And he says, with the basic question, what is part of the sacrament of priestly ordination? Just as it is part of the sacrament of marriage as an indissoluble union between those God ordained and set into the natural law, and that the de jure thing being celebrated this month is not applicable to holy matrimony. He says, because the determination of the flesh was established in the nature of man by the Creator. Of course, you're dealing with whatever else you may think about Cardinal Mueller. You cannot say that Cardinal Mueller is not intelligent. And this journalist in interviewing him is not on his level, we'll say, as you will see here with these questions. So the interviewer asks him the logical question: what are the arguments against the priesthood that can include women? And his response is, Jesus called the apostles, and from the apostolic office came the office of bishop, presbytery, and deacon. And this is symbolically linked to being a man. In his manhood, the priest represents Christ, the bridegroom of the church, which is his bride. He stands in an invisible relationship to the bride, the church. The church cannot be represented by a man either because it is female, and Mary, the mother of God, is its archetype. The fact that only a man can represent Christ in relation to the church lies in the nature of the sacrament. Now, they try to knock down what he says here by talking about how this is a reflection of the old law and Christ knocked down the old law, right? Their response is, the image of bride and groom comes from the Old Testament and testifies to subordination. The Second Vatican Council speaks of equality. Now remember, subordination. This is, where subordination versus equality. This is now becoming an ideology question, the women's ideology. That's what this is becoming about very quickly. In fact, this is what it's always been about. The secular notion of equality versus whatever the church might have said, which generally is that we are equal in the eyes of God when we stand before him in judgment. But that's not what they want. They want the secular ideology enthroned in the church. Mueller's having none of this either. He says, the image does not contradict the fundamental equality of all people in their personal relationship with God. It does show, however, that a man cannot become a mother and a woman cannot become a father, even if there's a tendency to relativize the creation-based foundation of human existence of the flesh. The calling comes from God. One would have to complain to God himself that he created people as man and woman. To which response is, can't women be called by God to the priesthood? Mueller's response is, if Christ himself is the founder of this sacrament, then he cannot contradict himself. He will not define the nature of the sacrament and at the same time arbitrarily call women to something that actually contradicts the symbolism of the sacrament. And that's kind of a key thing here, because the entire argument of this rests on the idea that God can change his mind, which tacitly rejects the idea that God is outside of time and space. God sees everything that happens at all time of human history from outside of it. It's a hard idea to wrap your head around that God exists outside of time and space. It's something that non-believers have a really hard time with. They don't seem to grasp that idea, and I suspect a lot of believers don't either. It's one of the hardest things to wrap your mind around. And this is why God doesn't change his mind based on the calendar and the progress, if you want to call it that, of human values. So they ask the question of, does that mean that God does not have the ability to call women to be priests? Again, we're talking about the inability of God to contradict himself here. So when Mueller says God does not contradict himself, we cannot use our considerations of possibilities to prove that God lacks logic. Human reason would place itself above divine reason if we were able to prove that God is inconsistent or even unjust. What there is here is a tacit admission that this entire question actually has the possibility of destroying faith, because you make God into somebody who's as fallible as the rest of us when you do this. God are immutable. They do not change over the time. They do not change to cater themselves to the changing whims and tastes of the culture. They're immutable. They last forever. Logical follow-up question is, what if women say they feel called? To which Mueller says it's a mistake. They can't be. It's impossible. It's pure subjectivism. This is, I feel. If you've been following along when I do my Pascendi readings, the Pope St. Pius X's landmark encyclical on the era of the modernists, you see, I have a document this Saturday that is from a lay writer who's synthesizing a lot of it to try to explain Pascendi, an old document that explicitly says it's open copyright. So please give it a view. Modernism is the worship of your feelings. It's the worship of the subjective. It's the worship of I feel. My perspective is the truth. It's a step away from solipsism, which is a complex philosophical position that basically says that I'm the only thing that exists. That's what it turns this into. And you see it permeating throughout this argument. They say, the interviewer asks him, he says, canon law states that only a baptized man can be validly ordained as a priest. Women are excluded from ordination per se. Legally, this is structural discrimination because the starting opportunities are not the same. I'm curious what they mean by legally. Are they suggesting the secular courts get involved in this? Most places, the secular courts aren't going to want to get involved in internal church squabbles. They're not. Canon law will uphold what the church has always taught on this. So one has to wonder, are they talking about the secular authorities here? If so, that's not exactly a subtle threat. Mueller, again, is not having any of this. He says, this canon in canon law is the expression of the sacramental reality of the church and is not a change in the nature of the church to a secular entity. It is not an injustice because women are not called. To which they say in 2002, some were ordained as priests on the Danube. What do you say about that? And again, this doesn't hold back. He tells you what he really thinks. He says it was a provocation unworthy of the sacrament of ordination. The ordination was not valid because inner prerequisites were not met. Women cannot be ordained as priests. It's not possible sacramentally. It was, I suspect, a mortal sin on the level of purposely making an improper confession. And I don't mean you play fast and loose with the number of sins, whatever. I mean that you're purposely holding back something you did in the confessional. That level of sin. Because it occurs excommunication. In fact, this would be worse than what I just said. And the interviewer says the women were excommunicated. The ordination of women is punished in canon law in the same way as Ted McCarrick issues by a priest. Do you think this punishment is justified? And the answer should be yes, obviously. These are not like items. These are apples and oranges. They're completely different issues. But they do have one thing in common, which is the misuse of church authority by the person doing the act. In this case, by the bishop who does this ordaining. Or in the case of the priest or bishop who does the McCarrick thing, they're misusing their authority given to them by their office to instill trust, and then they're misusing their authority to help sweep the problem away. There is that link. Mueller, again, is not having this, though. He says a church punishment results from the fact itself and not from the motivation of the offender. In both cases, it is about the misuse of the sacrament. In the secular criminal sense, the McCarrick problem is a crime that is punished by the state court. And in the ecclesiastical canonical sense, it is an offense against the dignity of the priesthood. That is why a McCarrick type receives both a secular and ecclesiastical punishment. The secular punishment relates to the crime itself. The ecclesiastical punishment relates to the fact that someone has also misused his priesthood. And it goes on and on. They're taking this and trying to put it on the same level as the McCarrick problem. Do you see that is what they're doing here? Mike Rizzio says that point about the faith is super critical. It relativizes the faith. That is what modernism does. This is why I always ask people, please watch those Pascendi videos so you understand what we're dealing with here. The core of modernism is vital immanence. It is this reduction of true faith experience to the level of the individual believer. And then whatever they experience, share their experiences with other believers who share their experiences, and from there you get the faith, which means it can be changed. That's what modernism does. And St. Pius attempted a wonderful job of explaining what modernism is and then destroying it with that document. Cool to understand what's going on today on this issue. So many issues we're dealing with. You'll probably see some of that remember, Francis is about to issue his document on the papacy. You'll probably see some of it there, but more importantly, in the fall, he's going to be issuing a document on devotion to the Sacred Heart. Weird timing. He should have had that ready for, the feast day that was last weekend. You're probably going to see more of that in there too. This reduction to the personal experience. It's not to say personal experience in the faith is not important. It certainly is, but they should not ever be the authoritative place in the faith. I will be putting all of this in my show notes at returntotradition.org so you can see these two articles. Mueller is, again, for whatever else you may think of Cardinal Mueller, he went to a hostile audience, to an interview he knew was not going to be asking him balanced questions. Imagine giving an interview to the National Catholic Reporter and having the job of defending a Catholic position there. That's what he was doing, essentially, except he was doing it with a Swiss version, because he is essentially in Europe the face of Catholic resistance among the bishops in Europe. That's what he is. Damien Keller says members of the Eastern Church argue that they have deaconesses. However, what they don't understand is the West, there are no deaconesses. Mixing of the two rites, East and West, is dangerous and anti-Trent. And even the return of their deaconesses that we reported on had gotten a lot of pushback from from other ecumenical patriarchs. Pardon me. That is what that's about. They have had a lot of pushback even in the East because they recognize what's going on here. But that issue with the Eastern bishops, the Eastern Orthodox bringing back deaconesses shows that these problems are there too. You're not going to find greener pastures going over to the East. You're going to find you're going to find confusion. It's going to be different, but it's going to be at the core very similar. Modernism corrupts everything it comes in contact with. And that theology is pervasive now in apostolic Christianity. All right. Deidre says, Armand Sr. said before concluding the cemetery mass when he prayed for vocations, then he said he hopes there'll be women priests. I couldn't believe it. I would hate to say it, but I would keep away from that priest at that point. When they say these things publicly, they let you know what they really believe. It's not ideal. You don't like to find these things out, but it does reveal what they really think. Going down this path didn't help the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is fragmented. You can go read about this from Religion News and other places. You know how the African bishops said no to fiducia supplicans? Well, in the Anglican Communion, their African, quote, bishops have publicly said they don't even recognize the authority of Justin Welby anymore because he's a heretic. They've said that. So this is a path that has never led to good places in the church. And they need to stop with this stuff. They really do. But it will take a good pope to do that. And I don't know if we're going to get one anytime soon, partially because I am of the mind that Francis will be around longer than most people tend to think. And there's no reason to believe that his successor will be any different, especially if Francis spends the next, whatever time he has left, not pushing fiducia supplicans and Amoris Laetitia level things. But if he instead does these nuts and bolts tinkering kind of things and things that are less overtly heretical, like you're probably going to see with that document on the papacy. All right, folks. Any final thoughts in the live chat about any of this? This would be a good time to get them in. As we go over any fun things, it says, wonder how many supposed deaconesses are also connected in the charismatic era. I'm not touching the charismatic debate that's going on here with the 10-foot pole. But it wouldn't surprise me really if outside of traditional circles you had this being more embraced. I mean, we know from Pew Research and other things that the people who go to the new mass typically are much more in favor of lady priestesses and deaconettes and all the rest of it. They are much more in favor of that than people who go to the traditional, whatever traditional mass, whether it's East or Western. They are much more in favor of it than those of us who cling to tradition. The modern female deacons are not deaconesses. It's absolutely anachronistic to conflate women usurping diaconal roles with those good and noble women who assisted in administering baptisms to women. Well, that's part of what the modernists do. And St. Pius X explains all that in Pascendi. Last week's episode really goes into that, into how they just conflate what they do in their apologetics by taking some example that's vaguely related to what they're doing from history and then just warping it beyond recognition. That's what they do. All right, folks. Well, Field says, I recently reverted and has been nothing but whitewater rafting since I came back. I am not deterred. Good. Don't be deterred. Well, and welcome back. Welcome back. Audio lagging. It's nothing I can control. This is way outside my control. I have a new router. It was the last thing I could do to fix it. And there just is not better internet service available here. And it's not like my neighbors are on at 4 a.m. So I don't know what it is. But the only thing I could do maybe is switch to Starlink. But since they involves broadcasting to a satellite, I suspect my lag issues would get a lot worse during bad weather, which is like half the year. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.